for the gifts we have to offer, and for this community which truly seeks to live out its covenant, that love is the spirit of this church and service is its law. May we be grateful. I was really nervous doing that thing with the kids. And I was like, it wasn't that perfect at all, but I'm like, that's actually part of why I want to talk about this today. And I'm so glad that stuff happens, where I get exposed to myself with children who always bring out that, right, out of us. So I had to get that out of my system. So I know how excited Unitarian Universalists get when I talk about Meadville Lombard Theological School. I've noted that since I began my journey here at UUI, and I was led to Meadville through UUI. For those of you who may not know, Meadville Lombard is the Unitarian Universalist Seminary in Chicago. It's a kind yet challenging place and space to build beloved community with Unitarian Universalists from around the world. It's a model of education that brings people together at least 3 times a year. The time together is deep, even if we're only in classes together for intensives for a week or for a weekend. When I began to attend Meadville Lombard full-time in July of 2016, I had no idea what to expect. I had just graduated from IUPUI, was going through separation, changes in my theology as a Mexican Muslim, learning how to be a single mom, and moving through the struggle of interdependence and independence, and learning the practical stuff of life that I had not done most of my life on my own, or if ever, while trying to find and pursue a full-time job. Meadville has been a safe place for me to explore myself, but so very intentional about awareness of self in preparation for ministry, whether that is parish ministry, community ministry, or chaplaincy. Now, the journey to exploring my deepest self did not begin there, and it also didn't begin here in this lovely congregation that has witnessed me go through an incredible amount of change in a short amount of time. My exploration journey began almost 6 years ago, when I began to address the areas of my identity that I felt were the most wounded. I began in places that addressed my life growing up at home and the dysfunction of my parents' marriage and the bullying that I experienced for a number of years as a growing girl and adolescent. I was sure that the majority of my pain and suffering came from these 2 things. And it's true that it has roots there, just that it's been much, much deeper than that. And it goes beyond the home and school life. There is so much more I do not know about myself and why a hyphen exists for me, as I proudly now call myself Mexican American. There's history that I have been unaware of, that I'm learning, that I'm connecting to, that you are all a part of because of the interconnectedness that we often speak about as Unitarian Universalists. I was excited to explore that history more this past July when I took a class titled Theology in Black and Brown, a class on what doing theology looks like in the Black community and Latino community here in the United States, and what that could possibly look like if we brought this intersection of communities together. A class taught by the humanist professor Anthony Pinn and liberation theologian Benjamin Valentin. I was excited for this class after this past year of really getting to explore my Mexican American identity and finally beginning to accept myself as a woman of color fully and wholly, and as a woman with complexity, after finally owning that immigration as a reality has been a pretty challenging and sucky part of my life and of my family's life. This class was hard and beautiful at the same time. Yet before it began, I kept checking the roster hoping that it would not be a mostly white class, because I wanted it to have the depth of stories of people of color so that I could learn about the experiences of others who know this journey. In this class, there were 3 Latinas, 2 of us from Mexico, both of us with lighter skin, both of us with border-crossing experiences that were different and similar and not necessarily always geographical. In this class, we also had a student from Colombia and another white female classmate who was raised in Mexico. We also had Black students, including Meadville professor Mark Hicks. The depth of this class was felt in my body. I sat in my seat and I took notes on my Google Doc, and I felt the urge to cry several times during that intensive week, and there were times I had to excuse myself. I was angry, I laughed, I smiled. We all made connections left and right. There were so many ahas in that room that clicked for us. And I was shocked by how much I had never considered in relation to my Mexican-American identity, as we engaged in conversations about communities that trace their background to Latin America and call the United States home. I was learning it for the first time, and I felt visible. I learned and relearned things like Hispanic as a term points back to the Spanish colonial conquest, that many of our people do not like this term because it privileges Spanish as a marker, and that there are those in the Latinx community, Latinx for an inclusiveness of everybody. So there are those within our community who don't speak Spanish because, as I shared with the kiddos, there are many indigenous languages, even in Mexico alone, many nearing extinction. When speaking of Latinos in the United States in general, 67% have multiple generations of being in the United States, even before the U.S. began to be called the United States. The Latinx community is hugely Mexican, making up nearly 2/3 of the Hispanic origin population in the United States. That's 64%, according to the Pew Research Center Census Bureau data from 2012. According to them, before the 80s, most of our Mexican origin population was born here in the United States. Since then, though, major migration waves have happened that brought up the numbers of immigrants born in Mexico. Now, in speaking about theology in this class, it was important to touch upon the internal struggle of Latinos and Latinas. In Latinx theology, a huge source is the self and the experiences that we bring because of a context around us that has attempted to erase us from the narrative, making us invisible. I learned about hybridity, which is the complicated nature of the Latino identity, having our history mixed with many groups around the colonial period. Many of us have the Spanish element in our roots, the explorers, the colonizers, the conquistadores. We have blood in us from the colonizers, while we also have the blood of the colonized. We have an African element that goes back to the mining of lands here and the labor that was needed for that. We have the Native American element from Mexico and our history in what used to be Mexico as well here in the United States. We are a mixture of so much. Even the idea of salsa music is a mixture, something that just comes together, right? The cultural injustices as a result of cultural domination has led to non-recognition, and many stories have remained untold in our Latino communities. There is such deep disrespect for Latinos in general, and very much so for the Mexican Americans in this country. If you're brown in this country, and you probably are seen through the lens that Mexican Americans are seen through, Latinos have often been depicted in early movies as drug dealers and drunks. Women have often been depicted as maids and subservient to men. The socioeconomic injustices are rooted in our political economic structure. There is exploitation, very much so for labor with Mexican Americans, economic marginalization, where whole groups of people have been marginalized from money-making mechanisms, deprivation of housing, affordable housing, access to medical care. Political injustices include not having access to being a part of the decision-making in the making of our own society. We have voting barriers and blocked access to legal representation. Even Latino citizens are caught in the entanglement of immigration and the fear and silence around that because everyone is grouped together. Just as we were in the 1930s into the 1940s, where up to 2 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans were deported or expelled from cities and towns across the United States and shipped back to Mexico. According to some estimates, more than half of these people were U.S. citizens born in the United States. The constant negative representation of Latinos and Mexican Americans leads to unrecognition and invisibility. If people are not valued and seen as diverse within their own rights, within their own community, they are not seen. And so our community faces racism, discrimination, sexism, you name it. We've been othered for a long time. And despite the long history of our people in the United States, there was no systematic effort to see us even on a census until the late 20th century. So why? Why am I speaking about the invisibility of Mexican Americans? Why not? Because right now, more than ever, with what's happening with the changes in our administration, with DACA recipients getting hit hard, with the uncertainty of their status, with the possibility and reality that people will and are already hiding, this conversation is more relevant and important for us to be able to humanize people once again. We're a community filled with opportunities to grow together, to get uncomfortable together, to stand together, to be humble together, as we acknowledge our history together and the injustice of those around us in our own families and the internalization of our own stereotypes. For me, Latino men have been invisible for me most of my life. With the job that I'm currently doing with scouting, though, more and more I find myself in conversations with Latino fathers. We've been setting up popcorn storefronts because I've been put in charge of the after-school district popcorn sale that allows us to remove barriers to scouting for inner-city youth that includes a huge percent of Latino kids. My job is an opportunity as it connects with my studies and my individual self-work to see my people differently and in some ways for the very first time. At storefronts, we have Latino folk that pass by our people that are we have Latino folk that pass and are instantly recognizable to me. I just know they speak Spanish. I used to be afraid to ask people if they spoke Spanish when I began studying at Meadville. I was afraid I was stereotyping my own people because we're very hardcore, right, on inclusiveness, that sometimes we fear crossing those lines and getting messy and making mistakes. But I've learned quickly now how grateful Latinos are to know that they have access to someone who can explain what the heck I'm talking about and why I want their money, okay? And they donate to support scouting, and they buy popcorn. They sign their kids up for scouts. They send them to camp. They entrust us with their kids. I am part of the entanglement, only I am one of the privileged now. I have a degree. I have 2 degrees. I've spoken English since I was 7. I'm lighter skinned, so I get profiled less and less than many Latinos do. And I'm now a dual citizen who can prove her citizenship. Also through an act. I became a citizen because of the Child Citizenship Act of 2000 that made me an automatic citizen. So yet the invisibility of Mexican Americans is becoming clearer and clearer to me now that I'm engaging with my own community. And I witness where this invisibility hides within us too. I was recently on a panel with a great group of women at the Peace Learning Center with a lovely audience, getting to speak about implicit bias. And we all had to take implicit bias tests before we were on that panel. And I took them in the areas that I'm like, okay, these, I don't know. I really don't know. This was put on by the Women's March organization here in Indiana. There was a moment in this live conversation where it got heated and messy. Dana Black was on that panel also. We had Black women, Mexican American women, and white women, Muslim women, women representing disabilities and LGBTQ identities. And then during this heated moment, I listened. I listened intently, but I had things to say. The facilitator, bless her heart, said to me that I could speak when I finally decided this was the moment. And she said to me, "You are so polite." And in that moment, I realized that yes, I was being polite and I was listening, waiting for the right moment, because I know what it's like to be unheard and to be invisible. But I also told her and the whole group that it's also connected to a lack of knowing of the power that we as Mexican Americans and Mexican American women have in conversations with Black women and white women and in spaces where we are not the majority, despite the fact that we're a huge majority in this country. Unitarian Universalists often speak about power dynamics. We are a community that at General Assembly recognizes why it is so important to have spaces for people of color. I am so grateful for that. In fact, going off track here, it was at General Assembly last year that I realized how much work I had to do. There was a meeting just for people of color, drum, and I didn't know what drum was or anything. I just knew there was this free lunch or dinner being offered. And I told one of my fellow Meadville seminarians, "Hey, you're hungry too. Let's go to this thing. There's food." We walk in together. She immediately walks out. She goes, "You stay. This is not for me." I was angry that she wasn't allowed in there, even though no one had said anything. At that time, I had no idea what it meant to have spaces for certain groups of people to figure out what their voice is, what power they have, and how they're going to utilize it, and why it was necessary for white people to step away from that. Because I had struggled my whole life identifying as Mexican. I was able to hide with my own identity, because of my lighter skin. I had internalized a lot of the colonization of my people. I still have it here. I'm so angry with myself, but in that, at GA, that was the first experience. So I'm so grateful that in UU, in our tradition, we make spaces for people of color to come together, where we actually say, "This is for you, and I'm going to take a step back." I'm so glad that Black folks have spaces in Indianapolis like the Indy 10 with Black Lives Matter. I'm so glad there are UU Latino Facebook pages for conversations and for UU Latina women. And now more than ever, though, we need to talk about Mexican American invisibility. I share now very bluntly that I will not call DACA recipients anything but undocumented Americans. Mexico is America, and our history is entangled with the United States, and our presence has been long before the term American was hijacked. Call yourself American, but know that there are Canadian Americans and Mexican Americans and South Americans and Central Americans. And know that within this land there are undocumented Americans who, because of a system that is cruel and difficult and picks and chooses when to exploit people of color and when to send people back to Mexico unfairly and to make the border more difficult to cross, won't allow these undocumented Americans to confidently wave their banner of being a United States American. We've internalized this so much as Latinos that my mom, who just went to Mexico, just got back. My brother made a Facebook post about good, safe, I wish safety for my parents on their trip to Mexico. And my aunt immediately called my mom and says, tell him to remove that post right now. Somebody's going to kill you when you get to Mexico. I told my mom, look, in general, there are tips for posting on Facebook. You do not tell people where you're at when you're there. You try to avoid that. I went there, right? And I had to give her a whole discourse. I'm like, my aunt will be okay. She's going to be fine. I'm like, don't wear all your gold jewelry. Like, of course, there's always all those tips. But it hurt me so much that we actually believe that our country is very much about drugs and killing and violence. My parents are no longer people from Mexico. They are here in the U.S., and I know, too, that they have a lot of work to do. So I know this is a time more than ever for us as Unitarian Universalists, though, to welcome and commit ourselves to work with DACA and the DREAM Act, finding a way to create a way for DACA recipients and their families to be here and no longer hide in the shadows. It isn't fair to take up Cinco de Mayo, to talk about tacos, and not pay attention to the community who all of that belongs to. We've dehumanized Mexican Americans in the struggle for those that are raised here without connection to Mexico because of immigration, because of being here for generations, is already a big enough struggle. We struggle with our own community, calling us out for not speaking Spanish well enough, not looking Mexican enough. We have our own internalization of colonialism that we are working on. We are a community far from perfect, but we are much more than our labor, our food, and the grants that organizations are able to get as a result of how many other kids sign applications with other. My hope is to leave us with more awareness and a connection to the community that needs to be seen more and more. Now, that work is messy. I don't know what the heck I'm doing. This, as I told you, was totally, I planned it this morning. I'm like, it can't be a story. Just have a conversation. I only myself am beginning to figure out what does it look like to work alongside Mexican Americans. One task I have taken on is to work now to create a Mexican-American women's group that begins with a book club where we will read books by Mexican-American authors. I'm working on a radio show again and interviewing local Mexican-American women for that, to lift up their voices and make room for their truths. So excited to get to interview a woman that I only found out about by going on Google. Her name is Reina Grande. She sent me her book. I get to interview her on October 10th, but the most exciting part for me is to read her story. I get filled with joy knowing, one, I'm not the only one, but to know that there are people willing to tell us what it's been like to be Mexican American. So, in what ways can our congregation be more committed to our 8th principle now? And I'll read it. We, the member congregations of the UUA, Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. This is a call to action. And I know we're tired, but so are Mexican Americans. This isn't about growing diversity here at UUI. This is about opening our doors and letting people bring their uniqueness if they want to be here. I love this place. You've welcomed me. You've seen my voice change as a result of being here with you. This is about us, though, stepping out and serving our community, a community that welcomed you into this country, if we want to put it that way. Making the calls to senators, continuing that work, calling our representatives, using our privilege. This is about making sure we're active right now in removing the barriers for voting and changing things in 2018. This is about willing to lead and making space for Mexican Americans to now lift up their own voice and letting us be angry. Please let me be angry. Don't get offended that I'm now finding out what I'm angry about, what deserves my right to be angry about. We need my voice and the voices of those who work so hard in this country, who are raising children and also care deeply about the quality of education of their children. And this is about making mistakes in our assumptions that people speak Spanish. You might be wrong. I may ask someone and find out that they don't. I have conversations with Mexican American people about not shaming Mexican Americans who don't know the language at all. Our history in the U.S. is complex, so I think that's a call to compassion. Yet we should know more Spanish at the same time because our country is growing and knowing another language is service, and it's a part of dismantling racism and oppression. So I hope that more of you know that I am personally okay, me, with you asking me about my story. That doesn't mean it's okay to assume that others will be okay with it. It's taken a long time for me to know that I have a voice and power. I'm not okay with being expected to share it at any time, to know immigration laws. I'm not a lawyer. And I can't always be a speaker for free, is what I tell people now too. So let's work together to also be involved with Mexican Americans in our issues. Let's explore it as a community. Let's make those mistakes together. Let's connect to the organizations that are doing that work in this community. And don't be afraid to unlearn what you've learned about us.